There is a pair of clay cylinders in the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities at the Louvre. Each is approximately 56 centimetres tall. Each is covered, top to bottom, in dense Sumerian cuneiform. Together they are called the cylinders of Gudea. They hold the longest single Sumerian literary composition ever recovered. The text records 2 dreams. They belong to a ruler named Gudea, who governed the city-state of Lagash, in what is now southern Iraq, around 2125 BCE. The cylinders were excavated by the French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec at a mound called Tello, starting in 1877. They had lain buried for approximately 4,000 years. The dreams they record are not vague. They contain figures, instructions, measurements, a drawn architectural plan, and a sequence of objects placed before the sleeping man in a specific order. What happens when you read them not as religious literature, but as one of 6 recorded transmissions, delivered by figures the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, into the minds of selected human dreamers across more than 1,000 years, is one of the most under-discussed problems in the history of ancient studies. The cylinders are larger than they sound. Cylinder A carries 30 columns of densely incised cuneiform. Cylinder B carries 24. Between them, the 2 clay drums hold approximately 1,400 lines of continuous Sumerian text. They are hollow, made of fired clay, and were ritually deposited, buried inside the foundation of a wall, in the manner that important documents in 3rd millennium Mesopotamia were buried so that they could survive. They survived. The cylinders date as physical objects to approximately 2125 BCE, the late part of the reign of Gudea, who held the title Ensi, or governor, of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash. That dating is uncontested. The dreams the cylinders describe occurred in the narrative frame of the text itself during that same period. There is no claim in the text that the dreams are older than the dreamer. What is unusual is what the dreams contain. In the first dream, a man appears whose head is described as that of a god, and whose body extends from the earth to the sky. Beside him stands the divine Anzu bird, the lion-headed eagle associated with the storm god Ningirsu. Then a second figure appears, a woman holding a stylus made of refined silver and a tablet on which the stars of the heavens are written. Then a third figure, a warrior holding a lapis lazuli plaque on which an architectural plan is drawn. Then a donkey pawing the ground. The plan on the plaque is, on inspection, the layout of a building that does not yet exist. The building will be the Eninnu, the great temple Gudea is being instructed to construct in honour of Ningirsu. The thesis of this script is straightforward. The conventional reading treats this dream as a literary device, a piece of royal ideology formalising the king's authority to undertake a major construction project. Read forensically, the dream contains specific elements that the literary device reading does not fully account for. A drawn architectural plan, delivered to a sleeping man in advance of construction, by a non-human figure whose physical description matches no human anatomy. A second figure delivering astronomical information in writing. A third delivering an executable building specification. The Sumerologist Thorkild Jakobsen, whose translation of the Gudea cylinders remains a standard reference text, treated the dream as theologically significant, but as fundamentally a literary construct. The alternative tradition researcher Zechariah Sitchin, in his 1976 book The 12th Planet, argued that the same dream, read against the broader corpus of Sumerian texts concerning the Anunnaki, is one of several recorded instances in which non-human figures delivered specific technical information to selected human dreamers. The claim has not been refuted by counter-translation. No competing translation alters the basic content of the dream. What is in dispute is what to call the figures and what to call the act of transmission. The Sumerians called the figures Anunnaki. They called the act in their own language a dream. Whether what the modern reader should call it is the same word is the question this script will spend the next 80 minutes examining. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like these has been incomplete, if you suspect there are tablets sitting in museum cases waiting for someone to read them differently, not as mythology but as record, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. Before going further, it is important to state the conventional academic reading clearly and without distortion. The mainstream Assyriological view of the Gudea cylinders, developed over more than a century of scholarship since their excavation, is consistent and well defended. The cylinders are royal temple-building hymns. They belong to a recognized genre in Mesopotamian literature, in which a ruler reports a divine command to construct or restore a sacred building, narrates the construction process, and dedicates the finished structure to its patron deity. Dozens of such temple-building accounts survive from the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Gudea's is unusually long and unusually detailed, but it is not structurally unique. The dream, in this reading, is a literary device. It serves a specific political function. It establishes that the construction project was not the king's idea, but the god's command, which transfers responsibility and legitimacy from the man who paid for the temple to the god who supposedly ordered it. The Assyriologist A. Leo Oppenheim, in his 1956 study The Interpretation of Dreams in the Ancient Near East, classified Gudea's dream as a typical example of what he called a message dream. In a message dream, a divine being appears to a high-status sleeper and delivers content directly. Oppenheim noted that this form was widespread across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the early Levant. He treated it as a genuine cognitive and religious phenomenon. Kings and priests reported these dreams, believed in them, and acted on them. But he saw no need to posit non-human agency behind the dream content itself. The dreams, in his framework, were products of a particular religious imagination operating in a particular cultural environment. Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1987 translation of the Gudea cylinders remains the standard scholarly text, agreed. Jacobsen treated the dream content as theologically significant. The figures in the dream represent specific Sumerian deities. The objects they carry are recognizable cult symbols. The architectural plan is a religious blueprint rather than a technical drawing. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose work on Sumerian literature anchored the field for half a century, located the Gudea cylinders in a long tradition of royal dream narratives serving as instruments of political theology. The Oxford Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, in her widely used anthology Myths from Mesopotamia, is explicit on the question of who the Anunnaki are. They are, in the mainstream reading, the high gods of the Sumerian and later Akkadian pantheons. The name itself probably means something close to the princely offspring or the offspring of An, the sky deity. They are not, in this reading, a separate physical population. They are the Sumerians' name for the divine. The conventional reading therefore treats the dream of Gudea and the dreams of the other Sumerian and Akkadian rulers preserved in cuneiform. Dumuzi's prophetic dream, the dreams of Gilgamesh, the warning dream of Ziusudra, the omen dream of Naram-Sin, as instances of a single literary and religious phenomenon. Sleeping kings receive divine instruction. The instruction legitimates whatever the waking king is about to do. The phenomenon is documented across the entire ancient Near East. There is no need in this reading to ask where the content came from. It came from the same place all religious literature comes from, the human imagination, working within a specific theological framework, generating culturally appropriate symbols. This is a coherent reading. It is supported by parallel texts. It is the reading taught in every undergraduate Assyriology course. The thesis of this script does not require dismissing it. What it requires is asking whether it is sufficient, whether it accounts for the specific content of the 6 dreams under examination, or whether some part of the content remains after the literary device reading has done its work unaccounted for. The break in the conventional reading began, in the popular literature, with the publication of Zecharia Sitchin's 1976 book The 12th Planet. Sitchin was not a Sumerologist by university appointment. He was a journalist by training and a self-taught reader of cuneiform, having spent decades working through the published transliterations of the major Sumerian and Akkadian texts. His credentials are routinely dismissed in mainstream Assyriology, and this script will not pretend otherwise. What is harder to dismiss is the specific claim he made. Sitchin's claim was not that the Sumerian text contained encoded science. His claim was simpler and stranger. He argued that the text should be read in the same register the Sumerians themselves used to write them. The Sumerians did not treat the Anunnaki as metaphors. They treated them as agents, beings who had performed specific actions at specific times in specific places. The texts list their names, their hierarchies, their disputes, their family relations, and the cities they were associated with. They describe acts of fashioning, of instruction, of warning. The Sumerians wrote about them in the same prose register they used for human kings. Sitchin's argument was that if you suspend the assumption that this register is metaphorical, and you read the texts as the Sumerians read them, certain patterns become visible that the metaphorical reading does not predict. One of those patterns is the distribution of recorded dream transmissions. Dreams, in Mesopotamian literature, are not evenly distributed across the corpus. They cluster. They cluster around moments when a human dreamer is given specific instructions or specific warnings by a named non-human figure. The instructions, when given, are technically detailed. The warnings, when given, are specific to events the dreamer could not otherwise have anticipated. And the same 6 narrative slots recur across more than 1,000 years of cuneiform literature. The first is the dream of construction. A ruler is shown a building, in advance of its construction, in sufficient visual detail that he can act on the specification. Gudea's first dream is the canonical example. The architectural plan, on the lapis plaque, in the hands of the warrior figure, is the executable instruction. The plan is not described as a general impression. The text describes a specific object held by a specific figure and inspected by the dreamer. The second is the dream of confirmation. After the first dream, the dreamer travels, physically or ritually, to consult an oracular figure who confirms and clarifies. Gudea travels by boat to consult Nanshi, the goddess associated with dream interpretation in the Lagash region. The second dream confirms the first. This pattern of paired dreams, separated by an oracular consultation, recurs in other Mesopotamian texts. The third is the dream of warning. A flood, a famine, or a political collapse is announced in advance to a single selected human, with sufficient specificity that the warned individual can take preserving action. The Sumerian flood tablet at the University of Pennsylvania Museum preserves the warning dream of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood survivor. Enki, the god of wisdom in the Sumerian pantheon, warns him of the coming destruction. The instruction is technical: build a vessel of specified dimensions. The fourth is the dream of foretelling. A figure who is not a ruler dreams of his own death, or the death of a loved one, in figurative imagery that is then interpreted accurately by another character. Dumuzi, the shepherd king of an early Sumerian dynastic tradition, has this dream in the composition that Sumerologists call Dumuzi's dream. The dream is interpreted by his sister Geshti Nana. He is killed in the manner predicted. The fifth is the dream of contest. Gilgamesh, in both the Sumerian and later Akkadian traditions, has a sequence of dreams before his journey to confront Huwawa, the guardian of the cedar forest. The dreams contain images: a falling mountain, an eagle, a wild man, that his companion Enkidu interprets as predictions of the encounter. The interpretation, again, is accurate. The sixth is the dream of catastrophe. Naram-Sin, the Akkadian king who ruled approximately 2250 BCE, receives omen dreams of his own dynasty's fall. The curse of Akkad and the later Kuthian legend preserve the tradition. The dreams are not heeded. The catastrophe occurs: construction, confirmation, warning, foretelling, contest, catastrophe. 6 narrative slots. Each one recurs in different Sumerian and Akkadian texts, with the same narrative shape and the same source attribution. In each case, the named figure who appears in the dream is one of the Anunnaki, Ningirsu, Nanshe, Enki, Inanna, Utu, or one of the lesser deities under them. In each case, the content the dreamer reports could not, by the conventional reading, have come from anywhere outside the dreamer's own mind. And in each case, the content is verified after the fact by specific events in the waking world. The plan is built, the flood comes, the death occurs, the dynasty falls. Sitchin's reading of this pattern was that the Sumerians were describing something real, not a metaphor for inspiration, not a literary trope, an actual transmission from beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki into the cognition of selected humans, performing specific functions. He was not the only researcher to make a claim of this type. Mauro Biglino, the former Vatican translator who spent 30 years translating Hebrew biblical texts for the Edizioni San Paolo Press, has argued the same about the related Hebrew material, that the Elohim of Genesis are read most naturally as plural physical beings, consistent with the Anunnaki described in the Sumerian sources. The aerospace engineer Alan Bond of Reaction Engines in the United Kingdom and the spacecraft systems engineer Mark Hempsel, formerly of Bristol University, have published on a separate Sumerian astronomical tablet, the Planisphere of Nineveh, held in room 55 of the British Museum, arguing that its data places its observed events on June 29th, 3123 BCE. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond is an aerospace engineer who has worked on rocket propulsion systems. Hempsel is a spacecraft systems engineer who has worked with the European Space Agency. Their calculation has been characterized as fringe in popular summaries. It has not been refuted by a competing astronomical calculation. No competing calculation has been published. The pattern Sitchin identified, 6 recurring dream slots with specific content attributed to named Anunnaki figures across more than 1,000 years, is what this script is examining. The cylinders at the Louvre are the densest single concentration of the first 2 slots. The other 4 are documented in tablets held in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and several smaller collections. If the pattern is what Sitchin says it is, the implications run in several directions at once. The first runs through Mesopotamia itself. The Eninnu temple, which Gudea built according to the specification delivered in his dream, was a real building. Its foundation has been excavated. The dimensions match the description in the cylinders to a degree that is, on the conventional reading, treated as evidence that the cylinders were written after the temple was built, as a retrospective religious narrative. On Sitchin's reading, the dimensions match because the specification on the lapis plaque was the actual blueprint, delivered before construction. The 2 readings are difficult to distinguish from the text alone. They become distinguishable when you consider the full inventory of what is described as delivered in the dream. The text does not stop at saying that Gudea saw a plan. It enumerates the cult objects that must be placed inside the temple, the materials they must be made of, the orientation of the building with respect to the cardinal directions, the timing of the construction with respect to a specific astronomical event, and the order in which the foundation deposits must be laid. This is not the level of detail one expects from a wish-fulfillment dream. It is the level of detail one expects from a technical handover. The temple was constructed. The cult objects were placed. The astronomical timing was, by the testimony of the cylinders themselves, observed. The same level of specification appears in the warning dream of Zeus Sudra preserved in the Sumerian flood tablet. Enki does not appear to Zeus Sudra and announce, in general terms, that destruction is coming. He instructs Zeus Sudra to build a specific vessel, of specific dimensions, with a specific coating of bitumen, and to load specific living creatures aboard in a specific order. The instruction is technical, the conventional. Reading treats this as a Mesopotamian precursor to the biblical Noah account, which it is. The question Sitchin raised is whether the technical specificity in the original Sumerian text is an artifact of literary convention, or whether it indicates the kind of instruction that, in any other context, we would call an engineering specification. The flood narrative is geographically anchored. The Sumerian flood tablet places the event in a specific region of southern Mesopotamia. Geological evidence from the lower Euphrates floodplain indicates a series of major flood events in the 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, with sediment layers consistent with catastrophic water deposition. The mainstream archaeological interpretation is that these floods inspired the legend. The alternative reading is that the legend records the flood, and the technical instruction record records the means of survival. Either way, the artifact is real, the tablet is in Philadelphia, the text is published, the reader can examine it. The same is true for the dream of contest preserved in the Gilgamesh material. Gilgamesh's dreams before the Huwawa expedition are not generic premonitions, they are specific images: a falling mountain, an eagle that lifts him, a wild man with whom he wrestles, and they are interpreted by Enkidu in a manner that maps directly onto the events that follow. The mountain falls, the eagle appears, the contest occurs. Either Gilgamesh and Enkidu invented the dream sequence after the fact to legitimate the outcome, which is the conventional reading, or the dream content represented a transmission of information that the dreamer could not otherwise have had, which is the alternative reading. The text itself does not adjudicate between these, it records the dream and the outcome. The implication of Sitchin's reading, if it is substantially correct, is that the Sumerian religious record is not a record of belief, but a record of contact. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not the projected gods of an early agricultural civilization. They are the named figures responsible for a specific phenomenon, the deliberate transmission of detailed information into the dreaming cognition of selected humans, performing specific functions: construction, confirmation, warning, foretelling, contest, catastrophe. The function of the 6 dream slots on this reading is not theological but operational. They are categories of transmission. The construction transmission delivers a buildable specification. The confirmation transmission stabilizes a decision under doubt. The warning transmission allows preserving action. The foretelling transmission allows preparation for grief. The contest transmission enables a specific encounter. The catastrophe transmission, when ignored, allows the catastrophe to occur. Each is verifiable, in principle, against the waking world events the text reports. Each has been verified to the extent that the texts in the archaeological record can be cross-checked. The Eninnu was built. The flood deposit is in the sediment. The Akkadian dynasty fell. The geographic anchoring of the 6 dreams is consistent. They cluster in southern Mesopotamia, in the great cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Girsu, and in the later Akkadian centres, Akkad, Sippar, Kish. They date, in their preserved forms, to a window of approximately 2,000 years, from the early 3rd millennium BCE to the middle of the 1st. The named figures who appear in them are drawn from a stable cast. Ningirsu, the storm god of Lagash, appears in the construction dreams. Nanshi, the dream-interpreting goddess of the Lagash region, appears in the confirmation dreams. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, appears in the warning dreams. Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war, appear variously across the corpus. The cast is consistent. The functions are consistent. The narrative shapes are consistent. The conventional explanation for this consistency is that the texts share a literary tradition. The alternative explanation is that the texts share a phenomenon. The British Museum holds the largest collection of cuneiform tablets relevant to this question. The Library of Ashurbanipal, excavated by Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1840s and 1850s, contains tablets that preserve the Akkadian versions of the Gilgamesh dreams, the Atrahasis flood warning, the Curse of Akkad, and adjacent dream material. The catalogue is open. The transliterations are published. The translations are in print. If you want to check this, the museum catalogue is open to any researcher who requests access. The same is true of the cylinders at the Louvre. They have been on public view in the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities for more than 100 years. The dream content has not been altered by any competing translation. The geographic anchoring of the Sumerian record extends, on close inspection, in ways that the conventional reading does not predict and the alternative reading does. The cities in which the 6 dream sequences are set, Lagash, Eridu, Uruk, Sippar, Akkad, form a distribution that corresponds with surprising precision to the cities that the Sumerians themselves identified as the original Anunnaki settlements. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld Blundell Prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, names the cities in which kingship was, in the Sumerian phrase, lowered from heaven. Eridu is first. The kingship descends from above in the language of the text and is given to a series of named rulers, each with extended lifespans that the conventional reading treats as legendary. The first 8 rulers in the antediluvian portion of the king list are credited with a combined reign of 241,200 years. This figure is generally treated in mainstream Sumerology as a literary device, a way of marking these rulers as belonging to a different category from the historical kings whose reigns are recorded in plausible decades. The alternative reading treats the figure as a record. Whether or not the figure is taken literally, the structure is interesting. The king list distinguishes a pre-flood era, in which kingship is held by figures with non-human scale lifespans, from a post-flood era, in which the lifespans collapse into normal human ranges. The flood that divides them is the same flood preserved in the Sumerian flood tablet at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, with the same survivor, Ziusudra, and the same instruction by Enki. The continuity is internal to the Sumerian record. The pre-flood Anunnaki, the flood warning, the post-flood resumption of kingship in human-scale reigns. These are not separate traditions stitched together by modern editors. They are a single narrative arc, preserved in a single textual tradition, copied across multiple cities and centuries with broad consistency. The Library of Ashurbanipal, the great Neo-Assyrian collection assembled in the 7th century BCE at Nineveh and excavated by Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1840s and 1850s, contains tablets that preserve the Akkadian recensions of nearly all the relevant compositions. The library held duplicate copies of the Gilgamesh epic in multiple versions. It held copies of the Atrahasis epic. It held copies of the Enuma Elish creation account. It held dream interpretation manuals and omen series. Ashurbanipal himself, an unusually literate king who had been trained in cuneiform as part of his royal education, collected these materials deliberately. His scribes were instructed to acquire copies of every significant tablet they could find from every major Mesopotamian city and to deposit the copies in the palace library. The library was destroyed by fire when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, but the fire baked the clay tablets and preserved them. Layard and Rassam dug them out in the middle of the 19th century and shipped them to the British Museum, where most of them remain. The collection allows modern scholars to track the stability of the dream sequences across centuries of scribal transmission. The result is striking. The dream content does not drift. The same figures appear, the same instructions are given, the same outcomes follow. Religious traditions normally drift. Mythological details change with each retelling. Royal propaganda is rewritten by each successive dynasty to suit its own legitimating needs. The Sumerian and Akkadian dream sequences do not drift in this way. The content remains stable across more than 1,000 years of scribal transmission. The mainstream explanation is that the dream sequences were treated as sacred texts and copied verbatim. The alternative reading is that the content was stable because the underlying phenomenon was stable. The Eninnu temple complex itself has been partially excavated. The foundation plan recovered by de Sarzec and his successors at Tello corresponds, in its broad outlines, to the description preserved on the cylinders. The orientation matches. The placement of subsidiary structures matches. The presence of foundation deposits at the corners matches. The mainstream interpretation is that the cylinders were composed alongside or after the temple's construction and reflect the as-built structure. The alternative interpretation is that the temple was built to the specification preserved on the cylinders, and the specification preceded the construction. The flood vessel of Ziusudra generates a more checkable prediction. The Sumerian flood tablet specifies that the vessel was to be made of reeds, coated in bitumen, with a specific overall shape. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, preserved in copies from Ashurbanipal's library at the British Museum, and from older sources at Yale, extends the specification with additional details: the loading of pairs of animals, the duration of the storm, the eventual grounding of the vessel on a mountain. The third checkable prediction comes from the Naram-Sin omen tradition. The Curse of Akkad, the Cuthian legend, and adjacent compositions describe a specific sequence of negative omens received by Naram-Sin in the years preceding the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The omens in the text specify particular events: a famine in specific regions, a barbarian incursion from specific directions, the failure of specific cult practices. The Akkadian collapse, as documented archaeologically, occurred. The collapse was preceded by a documented climate shift, a major drought event in the period from approximately 2200 BCE to 2000 BCE, which produced widespread aridification across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The conventional reading treats the omens as retrospective literary construction. The alternative reading treats them as a record of advance warning, ignored by the dreamer, that proved accurate to events the dreamer could not otherwise have foreseen. What is in dispute, as has been said, is what to call the figures and what to call the act. The academic response to this body of work has been, in the main, silence followed by characterization. This is not the same as refutation. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Characterization requires only a label. The label that has been most consistently applied to Sitchin's reading is pseudoscience. It appears in popular encyclopedias, in dismissive book reviews, in the occasional blog post by a working Assyriologist. What does not appear in any of the responses surveyed for this script is a specific counter-translation of any of the 6 dream texts. No published translation of the Gudea cylinders renders the dream sequence in a manner that eliminates the technical specificity of the architectural plan. No published translation of the Sumerian flood tablet renders Enki's instruction in a manner that eliminates the engineering content. No published reading of the Gilgamesh dreams accounts for the predictive accuracy of Enkidu's interpretation in a way that requires more than after-the-fact retrofitting. The pattern is consistent. The texts have been translated, the translations have been published. The translations broadly agree with each other on the content. What has not been published is a sustained academic engagement with the specific question Sitchin raised. Why 6 dream slots with consistent content attributed to consistent agents across more than 1,000 years, recur in the cuneiform corpus and what would be required to displace the alternative reading. Stephanie Dalley, in her translation work on Mesopotamian myth, does not address Sitchin directly. Thorkild Jakobsson's translation of the Gudea cylinders in its scholarly apparatus does not address Sitchin. Samuel Noah Kramer, who lived until 1990, was aware of Sitchin's claims. They were published during the last decades of his career and did not engage them in print. Kramer's silence is sometimes presented as a sufficient refutation. It is not a refutation, it is a silence. A silence has no truth value. The structure of the dismissal can be examined in 3 stages. The first stage is silence. The published claim is allowed to enter the literature without response. No review appears in the major Assyriological journals. No counter paper is offered. The second stage, which typically follows after a period of years or decades, is labelling. A category, pseudoscience, fringe, ancient astronaut hypothesis, is attached to the claim. The label travels into encyclopedic summaries, into online reference articles, into the standard discouragements that a graduate advisor will offer a student tempted to engage with the material. The third stage is exclusion from the textbook record. The next generation of scholars encounters the conventional reading without encountering the alternative. The alternative, in effect, ceases to exist as a discussable position within the discipline. This 3-stage pattern has been documented across multiple fields. It is not unique to the Anunnaki question. It is the standard institutional response to a claim that, if taken seriously, would require revisions the discipline is not equipped to make. The Anunnaki case has moved through all 3 stages. The published record in the major Assyriological journals, the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, the Zeitschrift for Assyriology, the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, contains, as far as a literature search can determine, no sustained engagement with Sitchin's specific philological claims. Sitchin's claim that the Sumerian compound Anunnaki, conventionally translated as the offspring of An, can be read as those who from heaven to earth came, is a philological proposition. It can be tested by reference to the comparative Akkadian and Sumerian lexica. It has not been tested in the published literature. The same is true of his readings of the divine determinative prefixed to the names of gods in cuneiform writing, of the Hebrew term Shem in the patriarchal narratives, and of the proper name etymologies he derived from the Sumerian onomasticon. The philological claims are checkable. They have not been checked. Mauro Biglino's parallel Hebrew translation work has received a similar response. Biglino's textual claim that certain plural verb forms and plural divine names in the Hebrew Bible are most parsimoniously read as referring to plural physical beings rather than to a single deity using a majestic plural, is a grammatical proposition. It can be tested against the comparative Semitic grammatical literature. The grammatical proposition has not been engaged in the published response. The response has been the label. The label has done the work. None of this proves that the claims are correct. The point is narrower. It is that the published response has not engaged the specific claims. The published response has applied a category. The pattern of silence followed by characterization has been observed in adjacent fields. The Boston University geologist Robert Schoch, who proposed in the 1990s that the weathering pattern on the Great Sphinx of Giza is consistent with significantly older dating than the conventional Old Kingdom attribution, was characterized in the popular literature as fringe. His specific geological analysis, that the vertical fissures on the Sphinx enclosure walls are consistent with precipitation, induced erosion rather than wind erosion, and that precipitation of that magnitude is not consistent with the climate of dynastic Egypt, has not been refuted by a competing geological analysis. It has been characterized. The pattern recurs. The Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, who proposed that the interstellar object Oumuamua exhibited acceleration consistent with reflective sail-type propulsion rather than outgassing, was characterized in the popular literature as fringe. The specific question he raised, whether the observed acceleration was consistent with outgassing given the absence of detected volatile emission, was addressed by a small number of follow-up papers, but Loeb's broader argument was answered in the main by the label rather than the calculation. The label sufficed. Schoch, Loeb, Sitchin, Bond, Hempsel, Biglino. The figures whose work touches the boundary between mainstream science and the older interpretive tradition received the same response. Their specific claims, where checkable, are not checked. The label that has been applied to them is fringe. The label does the work that in a healthier intellectual environment would be done by counter-calculation. This is not a complaint about academic conservatism. Academic conservatism is, in principle, defensible. The function of a discipline is to maintain a stable body of accepted findings against speculative incursion. What is at issue is whether the response, in these specific cases, has engaged the specific claim. The answer, as far as the published record indicates, is no. The Sumerian dream texts are translated. The translations are stable. The pattern of 6 recurring dream slots, with consistent content, attributed to consistent agents, is visible in the corpus to anyone who reads it. The conventional reading explains the pattern as literary convention. The alternative reading explains it as record. The two explanations make different predictions. The conventional reading predicts that the specific content of the dreams is generated by the dreamer's culture and theology. It predicts that the architectural specificity of Gudea's plan is a back projection from the finished temple. It predicts that the engineering specificity of Enki's flood instruction is a back projection from the surviving Mesopotamian flood narrative. It predicts that the predictive accuracy of Enkidu's dream interpretation in the Gilgamesh material is an artifact of narrative construction. These predictions are defensible. They are also unfalsifiable. There is no observation that could in principle distinguish them from their alternatives, because every specific content element can be reattributed to literary invention after the fact. The alternative reading, by contrast, makes a falsifiable prediction. It predicts that the 6 dream slots, if they record actual transmissions, should exhibit content properties that wish-fulfillment dreams in better documented cultures do not exhibit. It predicts that the cross-cultural recurrence of the pattern, in cultures that did not share a literary tradition with Sumer, should not be explicable by diffusion alone. These are testable claims. They have not been tested. They have been characterized. The dismissal, in other words, is not the same as the refutation. The reading is still open. The texts are still in the museums. The translations are still in print. The question of what was transmitted by whom into the dreaming minds of Gudea, Ziusudra, Dumuzi, Gilgamesh, and Naram-Sin is still open. The academic response was essentially silence followed by dismissal. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. That engagement has not occurred. To understand the weight of what the cylinders record, it helps to understand the world Gudea lived in, the city he ruled, and the temple he built. Lagash was one of the great city-states of Sumer. By Gudea's lifetime, Sumer was old. The first cities of southern Mesopotamia had emerged from the marshlands of the lower Tigris and Euphrates more than 1,000 years earlier, in the late 4th millennium BCE, in a process of urbanization that has no clear precedent anywhere on Earth. Eridu, traditionally the oldest of the Sumerian cities and the seat of the god Enki, was already an ancient site when Gudea was a child. Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, had been a major urban centre for nearly 2 millennia. Ur, the southern port city that would later become the capital of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, was a flourishing community of canals, ziggurats, scribal schools and merchant houses. Nippur, the religious centre of the entire region, held the great temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. Gudea's Lagash was a regional power within this much older constellation. The city itself was actually a complex of 3 closely associated urban centres, Lagash proper, Girsu, and Nigin, separated by canals and surrounded by agricultural land worked by tens of thousands of agricultural labourers. The Eninnu, the temple Gudea was instructed to build, was located in Girsu. Girsu is the mound now called Tello. It was at Tello that Ernest de Sarzec, the French vice-consul at Basra, began excavating in 1877, almost by accident, after hearing reports of antiquities being looted from the site. The excavation continued for more than 2 decades. It recovered, among many other things, the cylinders, the famous statues of Gudea in dark diorite stone, and a substantial portion of the Eninnu's foundation. The diorite for the Gudea statues, the cylinders themselves note, was brought from the land of Magan, which is the modern region of Oman, more than 2,000 kilometres from Lagash by sea. The transport of that volume of stone across that distance by a regional Sumerian state in the late 3rd millennium BCE is itself a logistical fact that the cylinders treat as ordinary. Gudea did not consider himself to be doing something extraordinary. He considered himself to be carrying out an instruction. The instruction had come in a dream. Gudea was an Enzi. which is a Sumerian title that is sometimes translated as governor and sometimes as priest-king. He was not a Lugal, a great king in the manner of his predecessors of the first dynasty of Lagash or his rough contemporaries in Ur. The second dynasty of Lagash, of which Gudea was the most prominent figure, ruled during a period of relative regional autonomy between the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the Empire of Sargon, and his great-grandson Naram-Sin, and the rise of the third dynasty of Ur. The Akkadian collapse was recent in Gudea's cultural memory. The Curse of Akkad, the literary composition that preserves the tradition of Akkad's fall, was probably composed within a few generations of Gudea's lifetime, possibly during it. The catastrophe was alive in the texts. Naram-Sin's omen dreams, in which his impending dynasty's collapse is announced and ignored, were not ancient history to Gudea. They were the immediate political past. Gudea's careful attention to omens, to dream content, to the precise instructions of the gods, makes more sense in this light. The previous dynasty had collapsed in the cuneiform record because its king had not listened. Gudea would listen. Gudea was, by the testimony of his own inscriptions, a builder of unusual focus. The cylinders are not the only document of his reign. More than 24 statues of Gudea survive, mostly in diorite, depicting him in a posture of pious attention, often holding a building plan on his lap. The plan in the lap is interpretable. It is the same plan he holds in the dream. The statues themselves are inscribed with hymns, with petitions, with administrative notes. Gudea built or restored at least 15 temples in the Lagash region. He cleared canals, he regulated weights and measures, he sent expeditions to Magan, to the Lebanese coast for cedar, to the Anatolian highlands for copper. He was, in the conventional reading, a competent regional administrator who took his religious duties unusually seriously. He was, in the alternative reading, a man who had been given a job and was doing it. The Eninnu itself was a substantial structure. The cylinders describe it in detail. Its name, which means House of 50, refers to a numerical attribute of Ningusu, perhaps the 50 divine offices, perhaps a measurement. The matter is contested. The temple had a high gate, a treasury, a brick-built shrine for Ningusu, a separate shrine for his consort Bao, and a complex of subsidiary structures including storerooms, kitchens, residential quarters for priests, and workshops. The foundation deposits, small inscribed objects buried beneath the corners of the building, included copper figurines of Gudea kneeling, peg-like in form, designed to fix the temple to its location in cosmic geography. Several of these foundation deposits survive in museum collections, including in the Louvre, alongside the cylinders. The temple was oriented as the cylinders specify, with reference to specific celestial alignments. The Sumerian astronomy of Gudea's period was already old. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian scribes had been recording lunar and stellar observations for many centuries. The earliest Sumerian astronomical fragments date to the early 3rd millennium. The famous planisphere of Nineveh, the astronomical tablet held in room 55 of the British Museum, is conventionally dated to approximately 650 BCE as a physical object. But the observations it records, according to the analysis of Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel, place the events it describes more than 2,000 years earlier, on June 29, 3123 BCE. The Bond and Hempsel calculation has not been refuted by a competing astronomical calculation. The observation in question is consistent with a major aerial event in the eastern Mediterranean region in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Gudea's astronomical orientation of the Eninnu, while less precisely datable, draws on the same continuous tradition of Sumerian sky observation. The temple was not aligned to the stars by accident. It was aligned by specification. The specification came, the cylinders say, in the dream. The cuneiform script in which the cylinders were written had been in continuous use for approximately 1,000 years by Gudea's time. Its origin in proto-cuneiform pictographs used for the administrative accounting of grain and livestock in late 4th millennium Uruk is well documented. By Gudea's period, the script had developed into a flexible writing system capable of recording everything from royal hymns to mathematical exercises to private letters. The cylinders are written in the literary Sumerian of the late 3rd millennium, a register slightly archaic for Gudea's spoken language, but standard for monumental religious texts. The text is exceptionally well preserved. Most lines are fully legible. The translation is unusually stable across multiple scholarly editions, because the surface is intact and the script is clear. There is no significant disagreement among Sumerologists about what the cylinders say. The disagreement is only about what to make of what they say. The rediscovery of cuneiform itself is a story worth pausing on. For more than 2,000 years after the last cuneiform tablet was inscribed, the script was unreadable. The civilization that produced it had been forgotten. The cities of southern Mesopotamia were buried under successive layers of sediment, conquest, and silt. The biblical references to Babylon and to the lands of Shinar were known, but the language behind them was not. The decipherment began in the 1830s and 1840s, with Henry Rawlinson's work on the trilingual inscription at Behistun in western Iran. Rawlinson, a British officer of the East India Company, scaled the cliff face at Behistun and copied the inscription left by Darius the Great, recording his reign in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. The Old Persian was decipherable with reference to known languages. The Akkadian, decoded with reference to the Old Persian, opened the door to the entire cuneiform corpus. Within a generation, the major Sumerian and Akkadian texts had been transliterated. Within 2 generations, they had been translated. The Gudea cylinders, when de Sarzec brought them out of the ground at Tello in the late 1870s, were among the first major Sumerian literary compositions to be read in modern times. They were read in Paris, by scholars who had learned a language no one had spoken for 2,000 years. The reading has not changed substantially in the century and a half since. The Sumerian astronomical catalogue, known to specialists as Mulapin, preserved in Akkadian copies from the early 1st millennium BCE, but drawing on observational traditions going back at least to the 3rd millennium, lists more than 70 named stars and constellations, along with the dates of their heliacal risings and settings across the agricultural year. The text is a working astronomical document. It encodes the path of the moon through the constellations now called the zodiac, the bull of heaven, the lion, the scorpion, the goatfish, and the others, in a form that allowed Mesopotamian priest astronomers to predict celestial events with high precision. The catalogue precedes Greek astronomy by centuries. The Greek constellations that anchor the modern Western zodiac are, in their structural shape, inheritances from the Sumerian and Babylonian sky. The continuity is documented. The cylinder's specification of celestial alignments for the Eninnu, given to Gudea in the dream, draws on this older observational tradition. The astronomical content of the dream is not, in other words, an isolated assertion. It sits within a documented continuous practice of Mesopotamian sky observation that the dreamer's culture treated as a domain of regulated technical knowledge. The figure of Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, who appears in Gudea's dream, is documented across the Sumerian textual record. Ningirsu is closely related to, in some traditions identical with, the god Ninurta, the warrior son of Enlil. The Akkadian Anzu epic, preserved in copies from the library of Ashurbanipal at the British Museum, narrates Ninurta's combat with the Anzu bird, the lion-headed eagle that has stolen the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil. The Tablet of Destinies, in the Mesopotamian tradition, is the document on which the assigned roles and outcomes of all beings, divine and human, are inscribed. Whoever holds the tablet holds executive authority over the cosmos. Anzu steals it. Ninurta recovers it. The narrative is, on the conventional reading, a charter myth establishing Ninurta's authority. On a closer reading, it is a record of a specific contested transfer of administrative authority in the divine realm, narrated in terms the Sumerian audience treated as historical. The Anzu bird appears in Gudea's dream beside the figure with the head of a god and the body extending to the sky. The presence of Anzu, the same Anzu, beside the dream figure is interpretable. The dreamer is being shown not a generic divine apparition, but a specific named figure from a known narrative cycle, accompanied by a specific named creature with a known biographical history in the cuneiform record. This is the level of specificity the cylinders preserve. The dream is not vague. The mythological context has been excavated. The archaeology of Mesopotamian dream practice has, in recent decades, recovered material remains that bear on the question. At the Inanna Temple at Nippur, excavated by the joint expedition of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Chicago in the 1950s, a small chamber off the main shrine was identified, on textual and architectural grounds, as a probable dream incubation chamber, what the Akkadian texts call a bit shootily. The chamber is windowless, with a single low entrance, and contained at the time of excavation the remains of a low platform on which a sleeper could lie. Similar small chambers have been identified at the Ur-Ziggurat complex at Eridu and at the Temple of Shamash at Sippar. The chambers are consistent in their architectural specification: small, dark, oriented inward, equipped with a sleeping platform, located in the most sacred portion of the temple precinct. The architectural consistency suggests a standardized practice. The sleeper would enter the chamber after a period of ritual preparation, fasting, purification, the offering of specific cult goods, and would sleep within the sacred precinct in the expectation of receiving a dream. The dream would then be reported on waking to a specialist. The specialist who interpreted the dream was, in the standard arrangement, a sha'iltu, a profession attested in the Akkadian documents from the 2nd millennium BCE onward, often held by women, with specific training in the interpretation of dream content against the standard manuals. The sha'iltu was distinct from the baru, the male diviner who interpreted omens from animal entrails and from the stars. The two professions operated in parallel within the same temple complexes. The dream incubation practice was institutionally regulated. It was supervised by a priesthood. It produced documented outcomes that were recorded, archived, and consulted. The Neo-Assyrian period preserves particularly detailed records of royal dream consultation. Esarhaddon, the 7th century king who restored Babylon, recorded receiving a specific reassuring dream from the goddess Ishtar at her temple at Arbela. The dream content is preserved in the royal inscriptions. The form of the dream, direct address by a named deity to the sleeping king, matches the Gudea form. The continuity of the form across more than a millennium of cuneiform practice is documented in the texts themselves. Mesopotamian dream practice, as Oppenheim and his successors have documented, was a complex and regulated phenomenon. Dreams were classified by type. Dream interpreters were a professional class attached to temples with their own training and apprenticeship traditions. Dream incubation, the deliberate seeking of a dream message by sleeping in a sacred space, was a standard ritual procedure. Temples were equipped with dream chambers. Priests recorded dreams in journals. Some of these journals survive. The phenomenon, in other words, was treated by the culture itself as a serious operational practice. It was not regarded as private fantasy. Dreams produced actionable information. Kings consulted dream interpreters before military expeditions, before treaties, before construction projects. The dream interpretation manuals that survive, including a substantial Babylonian dream manual, catalogued in the British Museum and known to specialists as the Dream Book, list specific dream contents and their established meanings. A man dreaming of flying may expect a journey. A woman dreaming of fish may expect pregnancy. The manual is long and detailed. It treats the relationship between dream content and waking outcome as systematically observable. Whatever the underlying nature of the phenomenon, the culture treated it as a domain of repeatable practice. Within that culture, the 6 recurring dream slots stood out. They were not the dreams of ordinary people. They were the dreams that founded temples, predicted floods, foretold deaths, won battles, and announced the fall of empires. They were the dreams that mattered. They were the dreams that the scribes wrote down. They are the dreams that survived. The cylinders are now displayed in a quiet gallery in the Louvre, behind glass, with a museum label in French. Visitors pass them at a rate of several hundred a day. Most do not stop. The label gives the basic information: Gudea, Lagash, late 3rd millennium BCE, dream of Ningersu, building of the Eninnu, and the basic information is correct. It does not say what is in the dream. To know that, the visitor would have to read the translation. The translation is in print. It is also available in transliteration and translation on multiple academic websites maintained by Oxford, by the University of California, Los Angeles, and by the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus Project. The text is available to any researcher who wants to check it. It has been available in some form since the 1880s. The pattern is not confined to Sumer. The same 6 dream slots: construction, confirmation, warning, foretelling, contest, catastrophe, appear in the religious literature of cultures that had no documented contact with Mesopotamia at the time the relevant texts were composed. The most thoroughly developed parallel is in the Book of Enoch, the apocryphal Jewish composition preserved in full only in the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon. The Book of Enoch is older than the conventional periodization of apocryphal Jewish literature would suggest. fragments of the Aramaic original were recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, dating to the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, and the underlying traditions are believed by mainstream scholars to be older still. The book describes the descent of 200 figures called the Watchers, who are explicitly identified as members of the heavenly host, onto Mount Hermon in the southern Levant. The Watchers teach humans specific bodies of knowledge. Asael teaches metalworking and weapon manufacture. Shemiaza teaches enchantments. Barakel teaches astrology. Kokabel teaches the constellations. Serial teaches the courses of the moon. The Watchers also take human wives and produce hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, who become a problem requiring divine intervention. The Book of Enoch is, on any reading, a striking text. The instruction motif, specific bodies of technical knowledge delivered to humans by named non-human figures, is present in the same form as in the Sumerian construction and warning dreams. The transmission is no longer described as a dream in the Book of Enoch. It is described as direct contact. But the function is the same. Selected humans receive specific information that, in the dreamer's culture, is treated as not having been previously known. The information is then used to do specific things in the waking world. The pyramid texts of Unas, inscribed on the interior walls of the pyramid of the 5th dynasty pharaoh Unas at Saqqara in Egypt, dated to approximately 2375 BCE, present a related phenomenon in a different register. The pyramid texts are the oldest extant religious literature in the world, predating both the Sumerian temple hymns of Gudea's period and any of the dream narratives in question. They describe a process by which the deceased king ascends to the sky and joins a category of beings called the imperishable stars. The texts specify the names of these beings, the order of operations by which the king joins them, and the technical content of the post-mortem journey. The pyramid texts are not dreams, they are funerary instructions, but they share the property of specifying technical information about a non-human domain, attributed to non-human sources, transmitted into the human ritual tradition with sufficient detail to be operationally usable by the priests who carved the texts. The Egyptian and the Sumerian traditions developed in geographic proximity but cultural separation. The languages are unrelated. The pantheons are distinct. The transmission cannot be explained by direct borrowing in either direction. The Popol Vuh, the Quiché Maya creation narrative compiled in the highlands of Guatemala in the 16th century from older oral traditions, describes the gods' deliberate fashioning of humans through a sequence of attempts. The first humans, made of mud, fail. The second, made of wood, fail. The third, made of maize, succeed. The fashioning is described as deliberate. The makers are named. The materials are specified. The Maya tradition, isolated from Mesopotamia by more than 14,000 kilometers of land and ocean, preserves a creation account whose structural shape, selected humans fashioned by named non-human agents according to a specification, matches the Sumerian accounts in the Atrahasis and Enuma Elish material. The mainstream explanation for the parallel is shared mythological inheritance from a deep prehistoric source. This explanation is plausible. It is also untestable. The Hopi emergence traditions, recorded in the 20th century from Hopi religious teachers in northern Arizona, describe a sequence of 4 worlds, each terminated by catastrophe, with a small group of selected humans surviving each ending under the guidance of a figure called Masor, the spirit of the earth. The instructions Masor gives are specific. The location of the emergence is identified, a place near the Grand Canyon in the present Hopi territory. The schedule of catastrophes is enumerated. The Hopi tradition treats the instructions as actionable. They are still followed, ritually, in the Kachina ceremonies that structure the Hopi religious year. The Dogon Sirius traditions, recorded by the French anthropologist Marcel Griaule from Dogon elders in Mali in the 1940s, describe a star called Potolo, identified by Griaule as the white dwarf companion of Sirius A, with a description of its mass and orbital period that, in the controversial reading of Griaule's notes, exceeds what should have been available to a non-literate West African society at the time. The Dogon case is more contested than the others. Griaule's methodology has been challenged. The transmission may have been contaminated by exposure to European astronomical information in the late 19th or early 20th century. But the body of Dogon astronomical knowledge that Griaule recorded is, on inspection, more extensive than the diffusion hypothesis predicts. It includes accurate descriptions of the orbital characteristics of Sirius B that were not common knowledge among European astronomers at the time Griol began his fieldwork. The Yoruba Ifa divination corpus in West Africa preserves a body of 256 Odu, or divination signs, each of which encodes a specific narrative tradition. Several of these traditions describe the descent of specific non-human figures who delivered specific technical knowledge, metallurgy, herbal medicine, governance, the casting of bronze, to selected human ancestors. The Afar tradition is unrelated in any documented sense to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions. The recurrence is independent. The Takenouchi manuscripts of Japan, although their authenticity is contested, claim to preserve a prehistoric Japanese tradition in which non-human ancestors descended from the heavens to instruct selected humans in agriculture, governance, and the construction of sacred spaces. The Takenouchi documents are too disputed to bear much evidential weight on their own, but their existence, and the existence of similar disputed manuscript traditions in Korea, in pre-Christian Norse Europe, in Polynesia, in the Andes, indicates that the phenomenon of claimed non-human instruction is geographically near universal. The Vedic tradition of India preserves a particularly developed instance of the pattern. The hymns of the Rig Veda, composed in archaic Sanskrit and preserved by oral transmission across more than 3,000 years before they were committed to writing, are categorized within the Hindu tradition as Shruti, a Sanskrit term that translates approximately as that which is heard. The hymns are not, in the tradition's own self-description, human compositions. They are received transmissions heard by named Vedic sages, the Rishis, and preserved verbatim by their lineages. The Rishis are individually identified. The Sapta Rishi, the seven. Principal sages include Vasishtha, Vishvamitra, Paradvaja, Atri, Gautama, Kashyapa, and Jamadagni. Each is associated with specific hymns in the corpus. Each lineage is preserved in the manuscript transmission. The hymns themselves describe the experience of reception in language that is consistent with the Mesopotamian dream language. The seer enters an altered state. The content arrives from an external source. The content is then transmitted accurately into the waking ritual tradition. The Vedic case is structurally identical to the Sumerian case on the relevant points. Selected humans receive specific content from named non-human sources in an altered state of cognition. The content is treated by the receiving culture as not having been previously known. The content is preserved with exceptional fidelity across centuries. The Vedic and Sumerian traditions developed in geographic and linguistic separation. The parallel cannot be explained by direct borrowing in either direction during the period when the relevant texts were composed. The conventional explanation is convergent religious imagination. Cultures, the explanation runs, will independently arrive at the trope of divine instruction, because the trope serves a universal social function, legitimating power, organizing ritual, explaining the origin of skills. This explanation is coherent. It does not, however, explain the specificity. Convergent religious imagination predicts a recurring structural motif. It does not predict the recurring specific content. Buildings whose dimensions are given, vessels whose materials are specified, astronomical events whose dates are calculable, mortalities whose timing is predictable. The cross-cultural parallel is not, on close inspection, a parallel of style. It is a parallel of content. That is harder to explain by diffusion or coincidence, because diffusion is geographically constrained, and coincidence does not predict specificity. The strongest objection to this reading must now be stated. It runs as follows. Royal dream narratives in the ancient world served a specific political function. They legitimated the actions of rulers by attributing those actions to divine command. The function selects for specific content properties, namely, that the dream should be specific enough to be recognizable as relevant to the project the ruler was about to undertake, and detailed enough to forestall the objection that the ruler had invented the divine command after the fact. Gudea's dream is specific because it had to be. A dream that simply said, "Build me a temple," would not have served the function. A dream that specified the temple's location, plan, orientation, and cult equipment did serve the function. The specificity on this objection is not evidence of transmission. It is evidence of effective propaganda. The same applies, in different registers, to the warning dreams, the foretelling dreams, and the contest dreams. The flood warning in Atrahasis served the function of explaining why one specific lineage survived a catastrophe that others did not. The dream content was tuned to that function. The Gilgamesh dream served the function of legitimating the Huwawa expedition retrospectively. The dream content was tuned to that function. The Naram-Sin omen dreams served the function of explaining the Akkadian collapse without attributing it to ordinary political causes. The dream content was tuned to that function. In every case, the function selects for the specificity that the alternative reading takes as evidence of transmission. The objection is strong. It accounts for a great deal of the data. It is the implicit assumption behind the entire conventional reading. It must be steel-manned, not dismissed. The fully steel-manned form runs, every example offered by Sitchin can be reframed as wish-fulfilling propaganda with specifically tuned content, and the specificity itself is therefore not informative about the nature of the underlying phenomenon. This is a serious argument. It would, if fully sustainable, render the alternative reading untestable. The reply, when it is made, runs in two directions. The first direction is the question of what wish-fulfillment dreams in better documented cultures actually look like. The psychology of dreaming, as established in the experimental literature of the 20th and early 21st centuries, is reasonably well understood. Wish-fulfillment dreams are common. They are, also, on the available evidence, structurally diffuse. They do not, in the documented record of dream content collected from human subjects under controlled conditions, generate executable architectural specifications, dated astronomical predictions, or accurate prophecies of specific deaths. The kinds of specificity that appear in the 6 Mesopotamian dream slots are not typical outputs of human dream cognition, as currently understood. This does not prove that the Mesopotamian dreams record actual transmissions. It does indicate that the burden of explaining the specificity is not, contrary to the dismissive characterization, easily discharged. The second direction is the question of cross-cultural recurrence. The wish-fulfillment objection is strongest when applied to a single culture. It is weaker when the same 6 narrative slots recur, with the same kinds of specific content, across cultures with no documented contact at the time the relevant texts were composed. Wish fulfillment is a universal human capacity. The 6 specific slots are not a universal output of that capacity. The slots cluster around specific functions: construction, warning, foretelling, contest, catastrophe, and they recur with surprising consistency. The conventional reading has not explained the recurrence except by recourse to convergent religious imagination, which, as noted, predicts structural motifs but does not predict specific content. The state of the debate as it stands is genuinely unresolved. There is no published academic engagement with the alternative reading that has answered, with specific counter-translation, counter-calculation or counter-evidence, the specific case Sitchin and his followers have made. There is also no demonstration, from the alternative tradition side, that the conventional reading fails on any specific text. The two readings inhabit the same body of evidence. They differ in how they interpret the specificity of the dream content. Neither has refuted the other. The texts are still available. The translations are still in print. The readings are still both defensible. The question of which reading is closer to whatever the underlying phenomenon was is still open. The implications of the alternative reading, if it is substantially correct, are substantial. The history of religion would require revision. The texts that ground the major religious traditions of the ancient Near East, the Sumerian temple hymns, the Akkadian creation epics, the Hebrew patriarchal narratives, the early Christian apocryphal literature, would need to be read, at least in part, as a record of contact rather than as a record of belief. The history of cognition would require revision. The capacity of selected humans to receive specific information through dream channels, if real, would imply a transmission mechanism that current neuroscience does not include in its inventory of human perception. The history of architecture and astronomy would require revision in specific cases. The Eninnu would be the first known building designed externally and transmitted into human construction. The flood vessel of Ziusudra would be the first known engineering specification delivered by external instruction. The astronomical events recorded on the planisphere of Nineveh, if Bond and Hempsel's calculation is sustained, would be the first known case of a dated celestial observation preserved from the early 3rd millennium BCE. None of these revisions would be small. None of them require dismissing the existing scholarship. The conventional reading would remain valid for the literary and ideological dimensions of the texts. What would be added is a layer of historical technical content that the conventional reading currently treats as fiction. What would not require revision is the broad political and economic history of the ancient Near East. The dynasties happened, the cities rose and fell, the trade networks operated, the collapses occurred for the reasons the conventional archaeological record indicates. The added layer would be narrower. It would consist of recognizing that the religious and royal literature, in specific cases, records technical content delivered from external sources, rather than recording purely human imagination operating within a religious framework. The cylinders are real. The book is published. The question is still open. The cylinders are in the Louvre. They are in the Department of Near Eastern. Antiquities. They are approximately 56 centimeters tall. They have been on public view in Paris for more than 100 years. The translation is in print. Thorkild Jacobson's standard scholarly version was published in 1987. Zechariah Sitchin's alternative reading was published in 1976 and remains in print across multiple editions. A. Leo Oppenheim's foundational study of Mesopotamian dream practice was published in 1956 and remains the standard reference. The 6 dream slots, construction, confirmation, warning, foretelling, contest, catastrophe, are visible to any reader who picks up the translations. The figures who appear in the dreams are named, in the Sumerian, the Anunnaki. What they transmitted into the dreaming minds of Gudea of Lagash, Ziusudra the flood survivor, Dumuzi the shepherd king, Gilgamesh of Uruk, and Naram-Sin of Akkad is still open. It has been open since Ernest de Sarzec dug the cylinders out of the ground at Tello in 1877. It is still open now.